Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. It is my honor and privilege to have on the podcast Simon Baron-Cohen. Simon is professor in Department of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge. He's also the director of the Autism Research Center in Cambridge. He has published well over 600 peer-reviewed scientific papers, many on autism. He also created the first United Kingdom clinic for adults with suspected Asperger's syndrome. He's also a fellow of the British Psychological Society, the British Academy, the Academy of Medical Sciences, and the American Psychological Association. He's the vice president of the National Autistic Society and was president of the International Society for Autism Research. He's also been the chair of the NICE Guideline Development Group for Autism and has also been the chair of the psychology section of the British Academy. He's the co-editor-in-chief of the journal Molecular Autism and is a National Institute of Health Research senior investigator. He serves as the scientific advisor, trustee, or patron to several autism charities, and he has taken part in many documentaries. He is also knighted as of 2021. He is the author of numerous books, many on autism. Is one of his most recent ones, The Pattern Seekers: How Autism Drives Human Invention, is the book that we discuss. We begin the conversation by talking about autism, what it is, how it's defined. We talk about systematizing mechanism and the if and then logic, which he lays out in the book. We talk about the empathy circuit. We talk about the systematizing quotient and empathy quotient and how, what those are, how they work, how they're measured, and then how they kind of fit in a kind of juxtaposition with the big five for personality or for IQ. We talk about some of the sex differences there between those two quotients. We talk about the evolutionary elements of invention, how we understand autism in our society today, trends and autism as identity, and many more topics. It was an absolute honor to talk to Simon. He is very generous, very kind, and as people will hear in the conversation, quite brilliant. One of the things that is, I think, one of the most essential parts of this conversation is how we are within science and media and society. We're having this kind of, ongoing, evolving conversation about how to conceptualize autism, obviously how to treat it, but really how do we think about autism, and less of disorder and more, as Simon details in his books and in the conversation, about difference. And I think that's very, very important as we're trying to continue to evolve on how we understand quote unquote disorders. And really what's the most important thing here is how do we best help folks that are different in some ways, and how do we maintain their humanity, and really just try to understand how we can navigate with them in the world. And so Simon has been doing this research and this work for over 40 years. He's one of the best voices on autism research, and it was wonderful to have him on. Of course, you can listen to this conversation and all the conversations that I've had at my free Substack. So get over there, take a look, subscribe at convergingdialogues.substack.com. And I bring you Simon Baron-Cohen. I'm here with Simon Baron-Cohen. Simon, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. Is it sir? Is it doc? Is it professor? You have many titles before we even get to the first name. Which one do you prefer? Is it Sir Simon Baron-Cohen?
To be honest, let's just do first names.
Just Simon. Okay.
Okay.
Well, all that to say, you're obviously very established in your field. So for those that don't know you, can you give us just the brief snapshot of what your background is in, your education, your research, and what you're currently up to?
Sure. So Simon Baron-Cohen. So I'm a professor at Cambridge University, and I'm the director of the Autism Research Center here. And that's a research center that obviously looks at autistic people, but at a kind of multi-level approach, from basic science, such as genetics and trying to understand the causes, through to neuroscience, what's different about autistic people's brains, and their perception and how they process information in the world, through to kind of more applied research, looking at interventions and relevant support, what would make their lives more comfortable.
No, that's wonderful. I mean, I've read some of your papers in grad school, and I've read your books, including the most recent one, "The Pattern Seekers: How Autism Drives Human Invention: A 70,000-Year History," which is now in paperback through Basic Books. So everyone can find this everywhere now.
Yeah. So in the US, it's Basic Books, and here in this little island called the UK, it's Penguin Random House.
Ah, very nice, very nice. So let's just kind of start with the kind of 30,000-foot view here, and then we'll get into some of your specific research. So obviously, folks are probably familiar with autism, and there's a lot of I think inadvertently or advertently misinformation about autism. People saying that they aren't on the spectrum. Of course, there's many components of autism. How do you usually define? There's obviously the clinical way of defining it that folks in clinical psych use it, but how do you usually categorize or conceptualize autism just as a kind of defined term or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, because I'm sure we'll come back to it, that definitions are changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I've been in this field for like 40 years, and the people we call autistic today are kind of different to the ones we used to call autistic back then. That the spectrum has got broader, but the short answer is I see autism as both a difference and a disability. But not everyone would agree with that view. Let's start with the disability part. That these are people who struggle with social relationships and with communication, and they get very stressed with unpredictable change. So that's the kind of disability side. And there may be sort of additional disabilities, because some autistic people have learning disability or intellectual disability. Some autistic people have language delay or minimal language. But these are they're sometimes called co-occurring conditions. And then there's the different side, which I think is really important, because, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have heard about neurodiversity.
Yeah.
The idea that brains come in many varieties, and one is not better or worse, they're just different. And the differences in autistic people seem to be about strengths, for example, very good attention to detail, excellent memory for detail, being able to focus for long periods on a single topic and go into great depth, whole range of things. So to me, it's like a mix of differences and disabilities.
Yeah, I like the way you describe it. Is it fair to describe it so the DSM will describe it as put in a group as a neurodevelopmental quote unquote disorder? Yeah. Is that a fair way to categorize autism? Or
yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the neurodevelopmental part.
Okay,
because that's simply telling us that that autism is the result of changes in the brain, and that these changes happen very early. In fact, the latest research is really suggesting that the changes happen prenatally, even if the person doesn't get their diagnosis till childhood or teens or even adulthood. But I don't use the word disorder. So in that way, I'm different to DSM.
Sure.
So DSM, as many people know, it's the classification system published by the American Psychiatric Association. And most of the diagnoses in that manual are called disorders of one kind or another. But I think the word disorder can be quite stigmatizing.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's why I prefer difference. which I think is more neutral.
Hmm.
There's no kind of value judgment. And disability, I think, is really just reflecting that many autistic people are asking for support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a probably a more robust and accurate way of describing it. So you talk about so the big thing that you were talking about in the book and in your research is this systematizing mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And I know you've got some criticisms about this as well, so we can get to that maybe a little bit later. But just lay it out for us. You can get as much runway as you want here. What is the systematizing mechanism, and how do you root it in this 70 to 100,000 years of evolution, and why that's important?
Sure. So just before we get started, I use one less syllable. So I call it systemizing.
It's
right?
my American accent.
I mean, I think maybe in the US they like to add that extra, syllable, systematizing. But over here I go for kind of parsimony. So that if you economy of syllables.
We'll go with your way.
But what is systemizing is basically it's the drive to analyze how things work, and in particular to understand systems in the world. And a system is anything that follows rules, and therefore anything that's predictable. So it could be a mathematical system, like a formula or an equation. It could be a mechanical system, like that microphone right in front of you. It could be a natural system, like the weather, or an organ in the body. All of these systems, basically follow rules. And when you systemize, you're trying to look for the patterns or the rules, so that you can understand it, but also you can predict how it's going to work. And maybe, and this is the link with invention, you can change the system, you can tweak some of the components or variables to come up with a new, improved system, and when you do that, that is an invention. And bringing this back to autism, autistic people have a very strong interest in systems. So although they struggle with social information, particularly aspects of empathy, reading faces, understanding tone of voice, body language, reading between the lines in communication, when it comes to kind of more factual information, where there is data out there, they're very quick at looking at those patterns. And in my book, I described that the systemizing mechanism is like a circuit in the brain that we can assume evolved around 70 to 100,000 years ago in humans alone, so modern humans or Homo sapiens, just from all the artifacts that our ancestors left behind in the archaeological record, which are all signs of, I call them complex tools, which seem to be so different to the kinds of tools that any other animal has produced.
So you mentioned there that there's this, you talk about this if and then process, right? You give 4 steps: asking a question, answering it by hypothesizing, testing the if and then modifying that pattern. And so just chat about that, and then how that, I guess, maps on for folks that have autism. What is the kind of differences from just general folks?
Sure. So you're absolutely right that in the book, The Pattern Seekers, what I do is suggest that this systemizing mechanism looks for not just any old pattern, but very special patterns in the world. These if and then rules. So it's kind of logic. If I take something and I do something to it, then what do I get? What is the result? If and then. And the if in engineering terms is sometimes called the input. The and is often the operation, what you perform on that input. And the word then refers to the output of the system. But if can also be a hypothetical. What if I do this? It's kind of like playing with future possibilities. And it's the basis of experimentation. So again, I think Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, seems to be the only species that really experiments in this way. And if we just take a really concrete example, because sometimes this gets a bit abstract.
Yeah.
The earliest musical instrument that's ever been found dates from about 40,000 years ago. And it was a flute made from a hollow bone from a bird. And what we can sort of imagine is this ancestor picked up this hollow bone that had holes in it. And the if and then logic would be something like, if I blow down the hollow bone and I cover one of the holes, then it makes a particular sound. But if I blow down the bone and I cover two holes, then I get a different sound. So it's kind of like playing with very, very simple manipulations, if you like, just to kind of play with the patterns. And, if we just take that one example, this early musical instrument is a system. It follows laws or rules. It gives rise to a different kind of system, which is the notes themselves, what we call music. And it's got the potential, as we know, to be kind of infinitely varied. You can come up with new musical compositions, new types of instruments. So it's a kind of a very elegant example of something that even a 2-year-old human child could play with, but we just don't see other species doing this. And then again, if we bring this back to autistic kids and autistic people, they have a fascination for this kind of thing. They often, they engage in this kind of curiosity of trying to find the patterns. They might then do a lot of repetition. And if we talk about DSM lists repetitive behavior as one of the symptoms of autism, as if it's something negative. But seen through this lens, repetition is all about trying to find the patterns. And, autistic people are not just confined to repetition, because they can experiment. And you can either change the if, you could change the and to see if you get a new then. So, you could play a piece of music in one key, but then decide to put it into a new key and you've got something new.
Yeah, no, it's a very nice way of saying the differences between, this is, in terms of evolutionary past, this is what makes Homo sapiens somewhat distinct, this idea of intelligence and creation and invention. But then as we go further down the timeline here, is that there are different humans and different folks that can have a very potent or heightened sense of trying to understand this kind of if-then process, which you were describing.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose the big news is that if you try and measure systemizing as an ability or a drive, people fall on a bell curve in the population. So most of us are just average at this, but some people are way above average. They systemize nonstop. As soon as they get a new gadget at home, they're experimenting to see all the, what are the limits of or the sort of potential of this gadget. And other people will be kind of quite content just to, use one or two functions on a new gadget and not really explore it.
Well, I want to come to your systemizing quotient, but I before I get there, because I think it will be helpful to kind of look at the kind of three, if you will, is you also talk about this empathy circuit. And how there are cognitive and affective systems. And I think other folks, Paul Bloom has written about this. There's been a variety of folks that have written about this and done research on it. And you fit theory of mind in there, with flexible deception and flexible teaching and flexible referential communication. So just briefly give us this idea for the empathy circuit for folks with autism.
Sure. So the empathy circuit is very different to the systemizing mechanism. And you're right, there are kind of two parts to empathy. The first part we call cognitive empathy, which is the ability to recognize what someone else is thinking or feeling. And you might use, visual information like facial expression, but sometimes it just involves a leap of imagination. You're trying to imagine what someone is thinking or feeling. But the other side of empathy is called affective. empathy. It's the response, the emotional response you have once you've decoded what someone might be thinking or feeling. How does it make you feel?
Mm.
And in particular, do you have an appropriate emotion triggered by what someone else is thinking or feeling? So if you've figured out that someone is suffering, for example, does that trigger an emotion in you of wanting to go over and help or to alleviate their distress? So that's the kind of affective component. And it looks like autistic people struggle with the first kind of empathy, the first part.
Mm.
So when you give them, in psychology, we call them performance measures, photographs of facial expressions, particularly quite subtle facial expressions to decode. They struggle with that. Or if they have to read between the lines in order to understand humor, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or non-literal language, they can get confused by aspects of communication, and in relationships too. But in terms of the second part of empathy, once someone has told them how they're feeling or what they're thinking, they seem to have perfectly intact affective empathy. So if they know that someone's having a hard time, it upsets them too. If they know that someone has been badly treated, they're often the first to want to stand up and defend the individual because of some injustice. Or so they're. It's not that they struggle with all aspects of empathy, but it seems like cognitive empathy, also called theory of mind, is an area of difficulty. And again, just as we were saying with systemizing, empathy also falls on a bell curve. So, some people have really strong empathy and kind of tune into other people's thoughts and feelings all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And other people are just kind of average, and other people struggle with it. And what we've done is some big population studies. One of the studies I describe in my book was of 600,000 people who took the EQ, the empathy quotient, and the SQ, the systemizing quotient, just as online measures. And what we found is that you can divide people into 5 different brain types or profiles, depending on whether they lean more towards empathy. So we call that type E. Or if they lean more towards systems thinking, which we call type S. Or if they're sort of balanced in between, so we call that type B. Or if they've got extremes of these profiles. So an extreme type S would be someone who systemizes non-stop. And a lot of autistic people fall into that profile, even though they may struggle with aspects of empathy. And the opposite is the extreme of type E for empathizers. People who become overwhelmed by other people's thoughts and feelings, but they may struggle to understand the inanimate or abstract world of patterns.
Yeah, as I was going to ask about this systemizing quotient and empathy quotient. These 5 profiles, I guess you could say, as you lay them out. What does the 5 profiles say about a kind of range of neurodiversity, and also on the technical side of things? How has this work, I guess, been replicated to say, okay, how confidently can we say that this stuff is very rooted, very well?
Yeah. So on your first question, I think this is just one example of neurodiversity. So here we're just looking at 2 dimensions of the human mind, empathy and systemizing. Obviously, there are many dimensions to the mind, like language or memory, or all kinds of things. But even just on these 2 dimensions, you see variation in the population. The variation is the norm. So we've only just met. I've got no idea where you would fall on those 2 dimensions. But the important point is, whatever profile you have, it's not better or worse than another. Sure. It just reflects, that we all have strengths and we all have challenges. And on the second question about replication, of course, this is important. We published a study in 2018 which was that big study of 600,000 people, non-autistic people. Actually, 36,000 autistic people also took part. So it was big data. It's published in a journal called Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. There have been smaller scale studies which have replicated the same patterns. But, survey data, which is basically what it is quite easy to collect. And it's very important that these studies are confirmed or falsified by other labs. But these measures are being widely used, and some common findings are emerging. One of which is that there are gender differences on these aspects of the mind as well.
I want to come to some of the differences, but one of the ways in which sometimes if I see something that's novel, I'll try to kind of frame it to kind of how the mind works, right? Is this predicting machine of sorts? But in what we already have. So you were talking about how these are two aspects of the human brain, systemizing and empathy. I guess how would these quotients and this research kind of sit next to, if you were to do a kind of comparative analysis between stuff like how robust the literature is on intelligence, or on the big five for personality, and other well-established constructs in clinical psych or psych in general.
Sure.
How does it compare and match up to that?
Yeah. Great questions. As far as I can see, empathy and systemizing are kind of independent of the big five. So the big five, I'm sure many of your kind of listeners know,
yes,
it's sort of this well-established model for personality. But this seems to be kind of adding two more dimensions. So there isn't a kind of neat mapping between the previously studied aspects of personality and these two new ones. So I think that's interesting. For many years, people have just assumed, 5 dimensions can capture the whole of human personality. But it seems like, maybe it's a bit more complex than that.
Sure.
And the second part of your question was about
also with IQ, which is also
IQ.
well established and replicated as well.
Yeah. So IQ, I mean, I think this is sort of it's a very good question. I don't know that we've had enough research on it. Some aspects of IQ would benefit from this very analytic way of thinking that is part of systemizing. But I think probably these two dimensions of the mind sit more comfortably with Howard Gardner's model of multiple intelligences, where emotional intelligence or social intelligence would also be considered an aspect of intelligence. So, I think these are, they may impact aspects of intelligence, but in a way, these two aspects of the mind they're designed to help navigate very different aspects of the environment. Empathy is there to help navigate relationships, diplomacy, communication, teaching you mentioned earlier. They're very, very different, and systemizing is there to really help us understand the physical world, how to build things, how to improve tools, for example. And they serve different functions.
Yeah. No, I think it's great because obviously these things are very essential, and we need folks like yourself doing the good science to really have it that we can hang our hat on it and say, okay, we have really, really good science on this moving forward, and see then where it fits with some of the other constructs we've had. You mentioned the sex differences, or with also with brain types and how much genetics are involved. Maybe just chat about that a little bit.
Sure. So what we found in that big study was that on average, women score higher on empathy. And again, on average, men score higher on systemizing. So these are kind of small but statistically significant differences. Again, they're widely replicated. And to point out the obvious, they only refer to averages. So
Of course.
it's important. It's very important.
It's important.
We have to state that, just because sometimes there are kind of misunderstandings that, you may or may not be typical of your gender. But what we find is that about 40% of women, for example, are type E, and only about 20% of men. So that's where your empathy is at a higher level than your systemizing. And it flips over when it comes to systemizing. So about 40% of men are type S, where their systemizing is higher than their empathy, but only about 20% of women. So these percentages don't apply to all men or all women.
Of course.
But we're seeing interesting kind of trends in opposite directions. And we can speculate about why that is.
Well, I mean, it's definitely fitting with my, I guess, Bayesian priors of all the other things I know about, sex differences with other things, personality, intelligence, things like that. And there's the common thing of, men are typically more interested in things, women more interested in people, et cetera. But you're right. It is important to understand that while there might be some overlap on some other constructs, these are all averages. And of course, there are people that men that are, maybe higher in empathy and women are higher in systemizing. Of course, there's that,
Yeah. And then you asked about genetics. And, we had the opportunity to work with a company called 23andMe, which some of your viewers will know about is kind of a personal genomics company. You pay $100 or whatever, and you spit in a tube and your saliva gets analyzed for DNA. But the good thing was we could ask clients or customers of this company to also take these tests. So we could look at what's called common genetic variants, which are kind of versions of genes that we all carry, to see if they showed any association with how well you score on the tests. And systemizing seems to have a partly genetic component. And what was kind of a revelation was that when you look at those common genetic variants that are associated with aptitude in pattern recognition or systems thinking, they overlap with the common genetic variants for autism. The correlation was about 0.27. So this was a kind of, for me, it was a really interesting finding, because it was telling us that when we think about autistic people, we know autism runs in families, that there's a genetic component to it. Some of the genes that contribute to autism are not only associated with disability, they're associated with aptitude, particularly, understanding systems or patterns. That, deep in our DNA, we can see that autistic people, or how they think, goes hand in hand with an aptitude in understanding systems. What I see as the basis for a human invention. And that's the theme that I explore in the book, that autistic people have likely been contributing to human progress for the last 70 to 100,000 years.
Yeah, I firmly agree. And I think that there's, obviously we have, you give examples in the beginning of the book and some narrative accounts and things like that, which is obviously very important. I'm sure some people can think of that in their, their own lives or family members or things like that. I guess I want to ask about this evolutionary history. You talk about how systemizing worked for Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal. How is it that those early humans, if you will, or Homo, that species, they could not conduct this generative kind of invention, but it was what Homo sapiens, there's that, we talked about it earlier, that could do all of these things, and such as the wheel and writing and math. And maybe talk about that evolutionary history a bit.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you look at invention of tools, they actually go back at least 2 million years. So you mentioned Homo erectus, and even the Neanderthals, who were more recent,
Yeah.
But you see evidence of simple stone tools like hammers and axes.
Hmm.
Um, and one theory that I explore in the book is that maybe designing a simple tool or creating a simple tool is the result of a different psychological process that psychologists call associative learning, where you repeat actions that are rewarding. So if you're using a rock as a hammer to crack a nut and you get the reward, the juicy, food inside,
Hmm.
then you could just repeat those actions. But that doesn't necessarily mean you understand this if and then
Right.
kind of almost causal reasoning.
Hmm.
Um, and, if that was true, then you wouldn't necessarily expect what you just called generative invention.
Hmm.
You could stumble upon something useful, a simple tool, and just repeat it. And that seems to be what we see in the archaeological record, that for like 2 million years, before modern humans, there was very little change in the design of tools, and very little variety in terms of tools. And then around 70 to 100,000 years ago, the number of inventions just suddenly takes off. So there's the bow and arrow, which I see as a complex tool. If I take a stretchy fiber and attach an arrow to it and release the tension in the fiber, then the arrow will fly. It's this if and then logic. There's the first jewelry that we find in the archaeological record, which was a set of shells where someone had drilled a hole in each shell to make a string of beads. But invention is kind of almost unstoppable after that. We see the first sculptures, the first cave paintings,
Hmm.
and we're still inventing today.
Yeah.
We're inventing vaccines, we're inventing all kinds of stuff.
What do you think about this? I recently talked to Adam Booley, who works with Thomas Sudendorf. I think I got this right. And they talk about this idea of foresight, right? And they give an evolutionary account of how humans, and really, a lot of overlap here on some of the things you're saying, that language was key for humans in learning how to invent, but also in this ability for foresight to try and say, how can I plan for the next hunt, or when it gets colder, or when I'm going to travel. And that we've thought about memory a lot for a large part of the time, but this idea of this evolutionary history of foresight for humans, is really instructive for invention and for creation. I don't know if you have thoughts about the foresight bit, but what do you think also about the importance of language as well as being important?
Yeah. I think, once we could systemize, once we could do this if and then logic, that would have, first of all, it would have transformed our language, because it allows you to kind of make changes to grammar, or syntax, which itself is a system.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see language and systemizing as completely independent parts of the mind. I think, I think systemizing could be co-opted to make language more complex. And you mentioned, foresight.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you take the if and then way of reasoning, that's very much about sort of what would happen if I did this. So it's kind of it's all about thinking about the future.
Right.
It's not just being kind of stuck in the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the systemizing account can overlap with a lot of these other theories about what could have contributed to invention. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting how we have this kind of crossing and kind of multi-layering of sorts of all of these aspects. One of the kind of last questions here I want to ask you about is, you talk at the end of the book, or towards the end of the book, about these 4 Ds of autism: difference, disability, disorder, and disease. You mentioned some of them in the beginning. How do you usually, we're broadening this, right? You mentioned 2. How do you mention have these distinctions between the 4,
right,
and where that fits in with neurodiversity and this kind of spectrum of sorts?
Yeah. So certainly when I started in this field, people not only called autism a disorder, but even a disease.
Mm.
And that leads to a certain medicalizing of autism,
Yeah.
as if the goal would then be to try and treat or even cure or prevent autism.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is kind of this would be the worst scenario that we could imagine. We don't want to prevent autism, and it's not really compatible with the concept of neurodiversity, the idea that we should be accepting and respecting differences rather than trying to eradicate such differences.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at autistic people, sometimes they have symptoms that cause them to suffer,
Mm-hmm.
that they would wish to be free of. So I think it's important to distinguish between autism itself and co-occurring conditions that are independent of autism. An example would be epilepsy.
Mm-hmm.
A disproportionate number of autistic people also have epilepsy.
Yeah.
And I'd say that's a good example of a disease. A lot of autistic people have medical conditions like gastrointestinal pain or gut issues.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they would love to be free of that. So I think it's appropriate to medicalize the symptoms that they are looking for treatment for, and maybe even prevention or cure for. But autism itself should just be sort of seen as part of the differences that exist in the population at the cognitive level, as we've talked about, at the level of the brain, as we're beginning to learn more and more about, and it should be embraced and celebrated. If we think about different parts of society, whether it's the education system or the world of work, we shouldn't expect that everyone's going to learn in the same way.
Sure.
So we need to make space for people with different kind of learning styles. And equally in the world of work, it's some people would argue it's a benefit that we think differently in teams, that you'll have some people who are very focused on tech, for example, and other people will be thinking more about the end user and communication and relationships and so forth. Again, we need this kind of breadth, and we should be kind of embracing it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I guess one question here is how do we have this idea? You were talking about some of the disease components in terms of like epilepsy, things like that. But what about other things that kind of don't fit? So if there are co-occurring, so folks that have maybe, autism, but also, ADHD or learning disabilities, or even other things such as, sensory processing is a really big component sometimes as well. How do we, I guess, from a clinical perspective, again, there's a continuum here, and there are some pretty, in terms of some of the symptoms, it can be very hard for some folks to manage if you're thinking diagnostically the level 3 category, where it's very intrusive in their daily lives, especially for younger people. How do we, I guess, if it's a caregiver or a parent or something like that, how do we say, of course, we respect the difference and we want to maximize that difference and have this person flourish, but also be mindful that there are parents and caregivers that also have a really hard time with some of these differences. How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, and I think you're sort of putting your finger on areas that are kind of controversial. I think when it comes to children, we often just assume that parents can make the decisions on their child's behalf. So, do you send your kid to speech therapy if they're delayed in language? Do you send your kid to a social skills intervention because you feel that, they would benefit from that? Parents have been doing this, not just in the autism community, but they just do it more generally. They make decisions on behalf of their child.
Yeah.
Whereas when it comes to adults, I think it should be very much about, what does the person want and are they choosing it? So it's about respecting, individual choice, and recognizing that even with something like language, some people don't feel that comfortable communicating through language, but they might be more comfortable communicating through text or through sign or some other channel.
Yeah.
And just kind of recognizing that we are all different and we need to respect those differences. And I think the other thing is that you mentioned about a continuum of, let's say sensory sensitivity.
Sure.
We all differ in how sensitive we are to noise or to color or to taste or whatever. If these things are beginning to interfere in your ability to cope, you might well be looking for some kind of intervention or support or even treatment. And as for the co-occurring conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, there's all kinds, learning difficulties. I think we need to just listen to autistic people and see what do you want, and some people might say, I just want to be allowed to be myself, stop trying to change me. I don't have to conform to the majority. I can just be me, and we should go with that. Another person might say, I want to improve in my language abilities or my social skills, and we should have interventions available for what people want.
The last quick question I have is just about sometimes in society where things get kind of spilled out into social media and other things on the internet, people will almost try to kind of say they're on the spectrum or autistic as a type of identity of sorts. So they kind of like try to put it on of like, well, I'm socially awkward, so I must be somewhere on the spectrum. And I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, I have some of my intuitions about that where it feels, I get that people are trying to say they have difference, but I don't think you need to have this kind of identity about it that you wear necessarily. And I worry about flattening out the concept for folks that really do have some significant differences, not to minimize people that do have some, awkward, placement in social settings. So how do you feel about some of these kinds of tropes or trends of sorts in this way?
I think we're at an interesting point in history, because 20, 30 years ago, autism was very much part of DSM.
Yeah.
And the diagnosis was reserved for people who needed help.
Right.
And in the US, it's often, in terms of access to interventions through medical insurance or, health insurance. In the UK, where I am, we have a national health service, but the diagnosis was there to kind of be your passport to getting support. Whereas, I think the concept that autism is now part of your identity, on the one hand, that's acknowledging that, that autism is partly genetic. So aspects of our personality or our identity are kind of go to the essence of who we are and don't necessarily need to be medicalized. It's just, but I do think that that if we dilute the concept of autism too far, we're not necessarily serving the people who do need support. But I think, as I say, we're at an interesting kind of shift. Is autism a bit like, I don't know, other identities like being gay or being black or being Jewish or whatever? Is it just part of who you are, or is it a disability, so more than just an identity, and a difference? And I think these debates will, are happening.
Yeah,
I think probably it's all of the above. That we need to make space for autism to be another minority, which is respected for being different. And it's going to sort of, that autistic people want a voice quite reasonably, just like other groups in society, especially in terms of feeling that they've been overlooked in terms of their civil rights or human rights.
Sure.
And all of this is true. If we look at the world of work, in this country, 85% of adults who are autistic are unemployed. So that's a kind of shocking statistic, suggesting that when it comes to autistic people's human rights, in this case, the right to employment,
right,
there must be some kind of systematic discrimination going on or barriers to employment. And just as we've had to think consciously about how to remove barriers or remove discrimination to make sure that all minorities have equal access to the world of work, we might need to do that for autistic. We should be doing it for autistic people too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what comes through in your book and a lot of your work is how do we, for folks that have autism or something even adjacent to it, how do we respect the value of their humanity, even if they are different, but sincerely, not as a talking point or a campaign or slogan, but as you're saying, in ways of the right to work, the right to leisure, the right to health, the right to the quality of life. And I think those are the really, really important things we have to focus on for folks that are going through some difference.
Yeah. And I think, just to maybe bring out a distinction,
mm-hmm.
If you went back to DSM-3,
mm-hmm.
Homosexuality was categorized as a disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And it took the gay civil rights activists to take being gay out of DSM
mm-hmm.
and just recognize it as part of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Being autistic, I think, probably needs to stay in DSM because it's not just a difference, it's also a disability. And that may be an important distinction.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. But I think what you're saying, what I'm saying, what other people say is we can't just see the disability or even the difference, but really see the human. And I think that's what's really important. Simon, it's such a delight and a pleasure to talk with you and get all of your wisdom. Download it here. The book is called The Pattern Seekers: How Autism Drives Human Invention, a 70,000-year history. As we mentioned in the beginning, it's out everywhere in paperback and hardcover. Where's the best places for people to find yourself, whether it's online, your research, or any of those relevant places?
So we have a website, which is autismresearchcenter.com, which really has all of our academic papers that are available to download, and a lot of the tests as well, which we make freely available to other researchers and clinicians.
Nice.
Just to kind of make things open access.
Very nice. Very nice. I will put all those in the notes. Simon, I can't say enough thanks. This really was a delight and an honor, and just so nice to talk to you for an hour about all of your great work you're doing. So a big thanks.
I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.